Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Fernanda. And I am here on behalf of Professor Paulo, who unfortunately had a lecture, so he cannot be here with us. However, he has recorded a video to welcome you all to the second edition of our event, Rethinking the Future. So let's watch it together.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to welcome you to the second edition of Rethinking the Future, Social Global Interventions, a part of our Institute on Social and Affective Neuroscience. First, I would like to extend my gratitude to our supporters, CNPq, FAPESP, and Mackenzie. Their commitment and support make gatherings like this possible, helping to advance our mission and extend the reach of our work. My thanks also go to the Center for Health and Biological Science at Mackenzie University under the guidance of Professor Jean de Lorenz for their ongoing support of our initiatives. I'd also like to thank the Graduate Program on Human Developmental Sciences and especially its coordinator, Professor Miriam Ribeiro, for her support and collaboration. And of course, I must express my deep appreciation to the dedicated members of my team who have worked tirelessly to bring this event to life. Thank you, Ana, Bia, Bruna, Fernanda, Leticia, Pedro, Ruth, and Valdir. Each of you has played a crucial role in making this conference a reality. In the face of today's complex global challenges, from polarization and social inequalities to the pressing impacts of climate changes, our collective work in social and affective neuroscience has never been more essential. We are thrilled to bring together an international and interdisciplinary assembly of experts in neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, political science, and beyond. Our goal is to explore how emerging research can reshape our understanding and response to these pervasive issues. This year, we are also excited to include presentations by our talented postdoctoral researchers and feature several PhD and master's defenses, showcasing the future of our field. We are committed to make knowledge accessible, and I am pleased to announce that all sessions will be broadcast live on YouTube, making it possible for anyone interested to join us virtually and be part of these crucial discussions. Thank you all for being here and for your dedication to advance social and affective neuroscience. Let us make the most of this opportunity to learn, connect, and think about the future. Welcome, and let's get started.
Properly start our event. I think we're having some issues with transmission. I hope everything's okay. But now I would like to welcome a very, very dear professor. Professor Flavio Azevedo is a Brazilian assistant professor at Utrecht University. He teaches interdisciplinary social sciences, and his research focuses on political psychology, ideological attitudes, and he integrates open science into education. He has earned his PhD from University of Cologne with distinctions, I might mention, researching ideological asymmetries and political behavior. Flavio leads the Psychology Political Behavior Study and has co-founded FORT, which is an initiative. Thank you, Flavio, for accepting our invitation, and feel free to start whenever you feel comfortable.
Thank you, everybody. Love the introduction. It's good to see you all and know that I'm a friend of the lab. I feel the same way. Let me share my screen with you. I've requested via Zoom now. All right, cool beans. All right. So if for whatever reason the internet is not working, just let me know. I recently changed providers to a cheaper version. So let me know. All right. So today I'll be talking to you about measurement of psychological constructs. And there is, it's a little bit of a working, it kind of unites meta science and deep dives into, theory and measurement practices of the study of ideology. And first and foremost, this work would not be possible without Didier Ballesta, my co-author, that I'm very thankful for. Right, so This presentation is organized as follows. So first we're going to have, a variology, but in presenting this work,
Recording in progress.
Should I restart?
There's no need. You can go on. Thank you. Sorry.
All right. So this work is organized as follows. First, we're going to have a very brief introduction to the study of ideology. Then we're going to address the motivation of our research question and provide you with a summary presentation so that from the get-go, you know where we were heading towards. Then we're going to, review the presentation main claim, that is to say, what it is that we are finding, what are our main objectives. Then we're going to go through the inner workings of the methods and results. So we're going to present you a systematic review as well as an empirical study. And then finally, we'll be discussing some of the, we're going to identify a few problems. So we're going to discuss a few of the solutions that we can provide and how to make our work more cumulative in the study of not only ideology, but ideological asymmetries, everything that depends on or controls for ideology. All right. So this is the briefest introduction to ideology, so bear with me. So one's ideology is measured in numerous disciplines, ranging from social sciences to genetics. Also is used in humanities. It is used as a dependent variable, as an independent variable, predictor, covariate, and how to enroll participants into a study. And there are three main approaches to the study of ideology in general. So the first is the etiology of ideology, but it's sort of, looking at the political philosophy, the content of ideology. So think about the analytical study of, political philosophical clusters of ideas about a given ideology. So think of liberalism, progressivism, anarchism, conservatism, and etc. The second has to do with the medians through which ideology propagates or how it's expressed. So think about discursive and communicative practices in society at large. So cultural symbolisms, imagery, and institutional structures. And this is, just how ideology gets in from, say, political philosophy or the elites into the public. And the third is essentially how is ideology received at the individual level, right? So it's the phenomena of somebody receiving ideology. So it's ideology as taken by its bearers, meaning the individual. So, and then there we have two types of ideology. One that is the symbolic facet, which has to do with one's social identity or how she or him see themselves as, say, anarchist, libertarian, conservative, and so forth. And one has to do, and another has to do with the operational facet of ideology, which has to do with policy preferences. So this depends on political interest, political sophistication, political information and knowledge. It has to do with your partisanship, if there is such a thing on your country, and might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 n dimensions. All right. So this is essentially how we go about the study of ideology. Right. So the importance of ideology to the study of social sciences in general, but also humanities, cannot be understated. It's used as it's a very important variable. So it begs the question of how researchers studying ideology are measuring ideology. What are the current practices in trying to study this very important variable? So to our knowledge, there is little agreement on how to do this, and there is lack of theoretical consensus there's not as of yet a study on the measurement practices and its consequences. And therefore, to address this, we reviewed measurement practices by coding these practices as observed in more than 400 articles and published in social science journals. So, yeah, so let's, yeah. So this is essentially what we did. So we found, essentially what we're saying is that, you know, some findings in political behavior and the psychology of political behavior, so both social psych, political science, political psychology, but also, you know, other disciplines that are around it. And a lot of the long-standing pervading findings might be subjected, might be dependent on how we measure ideology. And given how much the field really hasn't settled in 70 years on basic questions like, does ideology matter? Is ideology more or less important than partisanship? Which is our one group, say conservatives, libertarians, whatever, more ideological than others? Are there such thing as ideological asymmetries, meaning that is there a psychological root? Are we sure that it is psychological predispositions and motivations that lead people to like or to endorse one ideology over other? So we think that all these questions depend on how we measure ideology, right? So that's our principal claim, that the findings that we currently have nowadays are dependent on how we measure. And that's why it's important to study it. And then we need to talk about the status quo. That is, how is it that we're going about this so far, right? So the routine practice is to measure ideology with one ideological instrument, which may vary widely from one context to another. So it varies like in content, number of items, in the scoring systems that they use, dimensionality, and more. But while we have this many varied ways to measure ideology, we draw conclusions in our studies as if it was in general. So we are relying on the assumption that these ideological measures are interchangeable. So if I swap one measure for another, it is the same result, no matter what they do. Practice is to assume that ideological inventories are used interchangeably, and we conduct one research using one ideological instrument, but draw conclusions that are the nature of ideology in general. So you see that there is an issue there, right? And, you know, while there are important differences between, say, political science, which mostly measures ideology by selecting pre-existing measures, and psychologists who tend to create their own measures without validation most often, there are problems of these practices when it comes to what extent does the finding of your research generalizes, is comparable, and is reproducible by other folks, right? So that's what we observe in this graph, is that, look, if, you know, this untested assumption of interchangeability, that is to say, if those measures of ideology are not interchangeable, if swapping one ideological instrument for another would yield a different conclusion, it poses serious problems to the comparability of existing findings. So when you're trying to make sense of existing studies, it poses a problem to the robustness and replicability of findings. So that's when you're trying to understand the differences between studies. And third, the reproducibility of these in the sense that, can we reproduce your findings in another setting using the same instrument that you used? So, for example, if I use a scale, an ideological instrument in Brazil, and I use it in the US or Indonesia or Eastern Europe, will the findings be the same? Are the political contexts the same? Are the political issues the same? Right? So all of this affects our ability to accumulate knowledge and move our science forward. So it's dependent on the severity of these violations, right? On this interchangeability that we're going to find in the literature, that we can adjudicate, that we can make a judgment about the extent to which a lot of these long-standing debates may be a function of these many different ways of measuring ideology. So for this, we essentially have, two claims for this study. Is that first, there is high heterogeneity in ideological instruments, content, and measurement practices. And the second principal claim is that substantive findings, because these are so different, they change as a function of the measure. And if we do show that, that's pretty big. That's pretty consequential for how we think about ideology, right? So one relates to the literature, right? So one has to do with looking at current practices, how do we go about it? And the other has to do with an empirical study, right? So essentially, one is a systematic review, one requires a systematic review, and the other requires an empirical assessment, right? And that's exactly what we did. We conducted a systematic review, and we also conducted an empirical study assessing the extent to which findings change, classical findings change as a function of the ideological measure. And I think that the strength of this work has to do with the fact that we're not testing something, in the empirical assessment. We're not testing something that, people have doubts on. We're just testing something that, it's pretty established literature, right? So if that changes, that's a problem across ideological instruments, right? Right. So let us. Okay. So in reviewing the literature, we decided a priori what would be the indicators of heterogeneity. How do we know that there is high heterogeneity in the literature? So essentially, those are the presence of many articles with non-unique, non-validated, or on-the-fly measures. On-the-fly measures are just like, just gonna use this, just like whatever, right? So there's no psychometric validation. Nobody cares about showing reliability evidence and so forth. At the same time, other measures of heterogeneity. So we can, think of even validated measures that might not be for one context, it might be for another. Another two indicators are, how different you go about operationalizing this measure. So we're talking about scores, like scoring methods. So you can get something right, you can get something wrong. You might strongly agree to disagree. You might prioritize some items. So it is about order. So all of this matters, right? The last indicator of heterogeneity is the lack of a one or more scales who are continuously being updated. So think of, for example, there are some scales like the C scale have been updated a few times and people use it in different ways. We also defined a measure of quality, indicators of quality, a priori, so before we conduct the study, just to, qualify our findings on on heterogeneity, right? So think about response coding, transformation, scale type, and all of that, right? So yeah, so those are our indicators of heterogeneity and indicators of quality. And now one last note on, just like if it's not clear up until now, there is there's a scope to this. So we're not talking about, for example, consider SDO and RWA as political attitudes and that is ideology. We're not looking at that. We're not looking at, sometimes some studies use zip code, sometimes use content from social media to say, oh, certain people are ideological and are not. We're specifically talking about operational ideology in all its forms. So even, it's like whenever you're taking policy items and putting it together. Okay. Right. So okay. So in reviewing the literature, there's a lot of meta information that we collected, sample specifics, things like sample size, type of sample, nationally representative. Oops. Oop. 1 second. Sorry for messing up the slides. Okay. Oh boy. All right. So we collected measurement specific things. So think about like, operationalization of social and economic conservatism. There's study specific things. There's information on cost. So essentially, we collected a lot of information about these we coded a lot of literature on all these aspects just to have a broader picture of measurement practices, and a lot of information on construct validation as well, because we think that it's the lack of construct validation that leads to a lot of these problems. So when reviewing the literature, what we did was based on Webster and Watson, Jalali and Willing, and others. Essentially, what we did was what is called a forward and backward search. So it's a systematic way to go about. So we select a few key literature or a few scales, and we see who they cite and who they cited, and we go systematically in chain to find the literature. And that led us to essentially find 136 articles that use ideological scales, and 258 in the forward search. So meaning that folks that cited one of these 7 works. So we identified in total 394 articles. Then out of these, 309 measured ideology in some sort of shape or form. And then out of these, 261 were available, and 47 use symbolic ideology. So that's the social identity ideology. And then 214, we could look at, the different measures, which then we had to reduce 7 for a final number of 270 articles. The 7 ones is that they used either RWA or SDO as ideology, which I find it super weird because both of these theories say, hey, we're not ideology. We are, a construct that explains why people endorse certain political positions, right? So they are psychological underpinnings of ideology rather than being ideology. But that's how it is. Right. So let me show you what are the results that we found, and I hope you're trapped on your chair because this is about to get wild. So in the to the right of the slide, there is a visual representation of the ideological instruments. So each color hue, so that is to say each color, is one ideological scale. And the thickness of each sliver, right, is proportional to the times that it has been used in the literature. So essentially, what you are observing there is in the papers that we conducted a systematic review on, the large majority of papers, they were used just once, right? But we also see that, we found 152 out of 207 papers, we found a new measure. That is more than 3/4 or 75%. So essentially, every paper creates a new measure, right? That's a lot of heterogeneity. That's a lot more than we thought we would ever find. And it's reason of concern because while it may be convenient to have these many measures, it is unlikely that all these measures, there's 152 measures, are actually measuring the same construct. It is similarly unlikely that all these measures are equally valid measures of ideology. So I think we're in deep trouble. We also had, 43 unnamed measures. Like people didn't even bother on the stats, but not even like, hey, this is my measure or whatever. We found that the most prevalent measure is the C scale or the conservatism scale, followed by De Vita's cultural and economic conservatism. And yeah, I think the sheer size of, of how many new measures is in of itself a lot. But if you look at how many scales are just used once, and we just take it for granted in the literature that, oh, that's what ideology means. It's something that we need to work on. Right. So there were some additional insights that we had about that we can derive from this literature, from this systematic literature review. So the first is that, we considered the fact that maybe we were creating, academics were creating these ideological instruments because of these old practices that we used to have, but that now is different, right? Now we're good. Now we're doing better. But in what we show in this slide is while there is some variance along the way, surely this trend that we're looking at seems to indicate that the numbers of measures being created are on the rise. So these highly heterogeneous practices are not a problem from the old times. We are doing this now. So it's very much a current problem. And this is the issue, to an extent that the literature is already saturated with these measures, but we are still adding more. And so it's getting worse. Another possibility that we thought was like, hey, let's not raise the alarm. Let's instead look at where are we publishing this research, because maybe those are being published in low-ranking journals. It's not, it wasn't peer-reviewed, or the quality is low, and etc. Unfortunately, as you can see for both political science and social psychology, our review indicates that on average, it is common to find these measurement practices in highest ranking journals. So in psychology, we see flagship journals like JPSB, PPSB, and also in political science at AJPS, APSR, POQ, which are they're the top of the journals, right? So in both cases, and it isn't a problem of quality here, right? To the extent that we can talk about that. Another thing that we verified whether heterogeneity of ideological measures could be attributed to a specific field. So, for example, oh, psychology is the worst, but political science isn't. You know, and but it is true. We did find that actually a lot of these measures are everywhere, but it is true that psychology does present a little more than twice than the frequency of political science when it comes to novel measures. But it also has a lot more publications that we found. So it is proportional. However, when you look at raw numbers, it's more, but that it just has to do maybe with our methodology. So far, I hope that we have established that there is a large number of ideological instruments, but unlikely as it may be, we did not investigate uh, content yet, right? We did not talk about what are they measuring. Maybe they are using all the same items, right? So we selected 10 ideological instruments based on the most prevalent ideological instruments we could find. And the essentially we ended up adding 3 additional instruments from the initial 7 that are the most cited from our review that wasn't included in the backward search. And the results are jarring. Like, so these 10 ideological instruments, right, they amount to 202 items. Okay, so that's 202 items. We found 60 unique topics while using a very conservative approach to broad categories. So in the table that you're seeing now, we display this Jacquard index, which is a statistics used to understand similarities between sample sets. So it goes from 0, so no overlap. So if the number you're seeing is low, it means that content-wise, there's no overlap. And 1, it's like total overlap, right? And what we are finding here is that in the best case scenario, 0.32, which are literally using the same survey to come up with items, the ANES, American National Election Studies, they found completely different items to do their ideological measure on. And the average Jacquard index is 0.113, right? So it's very, very low. The other thing that I wanted to show you is that, you know, a graph that presents what we call co-occurrence. So out of the 60 ideological issues or topics that we found across this 10 scales, right? And what you observe in this wheel is that, you know, colored circles for an issue or political preference indicates that a particular topic assess a social dimension of ideology, while empty circles indicate that that scale measures an economic approach. So that's just field circle, not field circle. And the colors obviously relate to a different ideological scale. And you can see that, you know, most issues are unique, but there are some items that are prevalent everywhere. Abortion is one of them, almost everywhere in almost 9 out of 10 scale, so that's 90% LGBT rights. But that's second with 6, but that goes fast, right? So when it comes like to women's rights, you know, just it goes like your position differs a lot very fast. So we also wanted to sort of zoom in the most used conservative scale, and that scale is the C scale or the conservatism scale. And what you observe is how one scale that was used across many different studies can be broken down into many different ways. and how this sort of lack of consistency in using that one scale might pose a problem also for generalizability, comparability, and etc. So think about, so first, it was used across different sciences. Then there's different versions. There's the Australian version. There's the universal version. There's many versions. And then people decided that it was okay to survey only 13 items. But they also added items to the 50 that are the original count. Why not? Why not add items? Then they said, I'm going to measure this with 7-point Likert scale, but also like binary, yes or no, maybe, and etc. And then I did the scoring, meaning like I came up with a final sort of range to rate people, to order people in a gazillion different ways. Some mean binomial, etc. So I hope to have shown you that as far as conservatism practices are concerned, well, as far as measurement practices using conservative instruments are concerned, we are a little bit in a mess. So this is the summary, right? Out of 152 measures from a sample of 207 articles, a whopping 75% are unique variables. The content overlap between ideological scales is minimal. And there is high heterogeneity even within the most used ideological scale. Items vary in content, in issue representativeness, in format, number, dimensionality, scoring method, latent technique. You give it, what it's just incredible. Half of those measures were validated in whatsoever format. So if somebody so much as provided a correlation table of the items or reliability index or alpha, we said validated, like the person knew. So like the threshold is really, really low. If factor analysis were conducted, validated. We know that that's not what validation means, but still, and that's still less than half. So that generates a lot of problems for, comparability, generalizability, reproducibility, and so forth. So when you come to the bottom right of the slide, you like, wait, to what extent is this cumulative, right? And that's an excellent question, right? How could this be cumulative with these many different practices? So essentially, the question that that we are asking is, okay, fine, the literature is somewhat of a mess. There's high variability and heterogeneity in how we measure ideology. Okay. So to what extent does it matter, right? Does it matter practically? Meaning that if you do research using one ideological instrument and you use, research with another instrument, are the findings going to be, changeable? Do they change? Are they stable? Are they comparable? So to answer this question, we also collected empirical data. That's the second part of our study, to put, different ideological instruments to the test. So in a nationally representative sample of 1,500 people in the US, we surveyed 6 ideological instruments and auxiliary variables to test established theories, both in political science and social psychology. So we wanted to investigate whether those measures are, empirically comparable. To what extent are they equally good indicators of ideology? To what extent does these measures present equally desirable and valid properties? Can these measures be used to arrive at the same result? And more globally, if we conduct research with one specific instrument, can we draw conclusions about the nature of ideology in general? So, in all likelihood, the answer to these questions, isn't black and white. They are, or they are not interchangeable, right? It's a spectrum, but studying which factors that leads to this is what is important. So essentially, this is the design of the survey. We have a 1,500 people in the U.S. But also confirmatory sample. The ideological scales that we used are there. Not that it matters much, but it's just 5 ideological scales. And I put them to the test to what extent they kind of show the same results, right? So the first study that I compared is that I try to test the same hypothesis is Ellison and Stimson's 2012, and essentially the main claim of the book Ideology in America is that Americans are symbolically conservative and operationally liberal. That is to say, they identify, when you ask them, hey, are you conservative or liberal? And they most likely going to say, I'm conservative. But if you ask their policy preferences, they will have pro-progressive policy preferences. You can quite see a little bit now in the election, the recent election in the U.S., how that matters a lot. And I wanted to show you more or less what one would expect to find, right? So the operational ideology. So this is just a simulation, right? On your graph, you have operational ideology, the distribution of operational ideology, more on the left side, right? Like the green on the left, and you have the symbolic ideology more on the right. Because the population, like looking at the entire population, people tend to be more conservative in their symbolic ideology, and they tend to be more liberal. But these are the same people. These are not 2 different groups. These are the same. At least with one scale, is the complete opposite. So let me show you. Using one of the scales, so the average scale, we find that while Feldman and Johnston and Zell and Bernstein, so the ZB and FJ scales, do or would normally corroborate Ellis's and Stimson's, we would have a reversal if we use Everett scale, meaning that we would find that no, looking at the population distribution, Americans are actually operationally more conservative than they are symbolically liberal, which is crazy to say. And the other 2 scales they have overlapping distribution. So we would be still a non-replication. So 3 out of 5 is a non-replication. So we could conclude that's not a stable finding, but 1 scale shows a reversal, 2 shows a non-finding or non-replication, and 2 corroborate the study. And I also tested whether Americans are or are not yet polarized. And, in the graph, essentially, I'm showing the case of low polarization, moderate polarization, and high polarization, and how they would look like. And this is what the actual data tells us. And essentially, it shows that by the author's own criteria, whether people are polarized or not really depends on the scale that you use. And I'm just going a little bit faster now, just so that we can wrap it up and have questions. There's a case study in which we were like, okay, we also need to study the psychology of this. What if we put in all the ideological scales and try to predict whether people distrust climate change? Or we also tested a wide variety of anti-scientific attitudes. It is a wide variety. Let me rephrase that. 3 types of anti-scientific attitudes, including one of which is, and what we found is that, and if you don't know, a multiverse analysis, right, which is this analysis that you see on your graph, I essentially run all the possible models. So I'm not like just running one regression. I ran literally, I think, I want to say 1,000,000 regressions or something like that. It's on the paper. I don't recall, but it's like a stupid amount of regressions. And I didn't collect, or we're not analyzing the result of one regression, but rather the distribution of the slope or the beta coefficients. And what we can see is that some scales, so I'm going to use here the pointer, some scales here are way more predictive than other scales here. So a lot of scales here would have said, hey, ideology does not matter in distrust of climate change above other variables. But if I use these scales, I would have certainly found strong, robust evidence of how they matter, right? So this sort of plays into that insecurity that we have, that for as much as we trust our surveys, we trust our methodology, our findings change as a function of the ideological scale that you use. As a last case, I will talk about Lee Druttmann's 2016 paper, in which he said, look, the libertarians compose 4%, 3.8% of the American electorate. And he showed a graph saying, look, people here on this quarter, if you type if you plot ideology on social and economic conservatism, you're going to have a lot of people that are, robustly liberal or progressive on both issues. Some folks on conservative issues. But very few people would be libertarian, meaning socially liberal, economically conservative, and 3.8. However, when we look at the data, what we find is, again, it depends on the scale that you use. There is more people here on Feldman and Johnston as what you could qualify as libertarian than technically on this quadrant that would be the opposite, like they are called populists or communalists. I'm not going to get into that because I think populism is an entirely different thing, and not to mention libertarianism is a completely different thing than just being socially liberal and economically conservative. But that's a talk for another day. In any case, let me show you other results showing the same takeaway message. So all this to say, and we're getting to the end, around 44 minutes, which is great because I've been told 45, is that the main takeaway of this presentation is that we've been conducting research on ideology as if we are using one single and the one measure, a single predefined, well-tested, cross-nationally validated measure. So currently we do research as if we were all using a standardized measure, but we are not. And this is what the study shows empirically, that the findings change as a function of the scale used, which poses a threat to replicability, generalizability, comparability, and etc. So when it comes to taking stock, these kind of characteristics of using different measures, no matter what, using non-validated measures, using on-the-go measures or on-the-fly measures, all of this have been associated with a higher risk of failure to replicate. It also points to the fact that there is so much jingle-jangle fallacies. And jingle-jangle fallacies, if you don't know, is that so it's the assumption, right, that two different things are the same because they bear the same name. So two different measures are the same because they bear the same name. So think about conservatism scales. Like I call my scale, conservatism, and somebody else calls this like the conservatism Flavio scale. And so but the items are different, the content is different, but we assume they are measuring the same. So it's that interchangeability. That's what's called jingle fallacy. And the other fallacy, the Django fallacy, when things are indeed identical, but they are labeled different. In any case, all right. So we found in our view that that's quite prevalent. Altogether, the third stock, the taking stock in the third point is that in 400 articles, we speculate that given for all these operational measures of ideology, it is very unlikely that indeed they are all equally good indicators of ideology. It's very unlikely they present equally desirable validity properties and they can be used interchangeably. It's very unlikely. And the implication of this is that maybe all the debates that we keep, we're still discussing whether ideology matters in political science literature. It's like we don't make a lot of progress. We are making a lot of progress for partisanship. Oh, partisanship this, partisanship that, because there's only one measure. It's not. We don't know if it's, well, we do know if it's good or not, but it's just one measure. And sure, there's a few different personalizations, but so that helps. But it has to do with this, discernment. There's this added complexity between how we measure ideology and partisanship. But without reliable measurement, the level of ideological thinking might be underestimated, right? So if we don't have a good validated measure, we might be thinking that the public isn't ideological, but in fact it is, right? So we're underplaying the role of ideology in as a consequence of bad measurement practices. Right. So we have a few recommendations. So push towards institutional efforts towards standardized measure. We've done this before. ESS does that. It's fine. It's not a big thing. We can do that, and we can take measures in time. We would know the properties across groups, especially across populations, and ideally time. We should also have different measures that are based on theories. So there's several kind of different theories. So for example, the horseshoe theory or ideology as motivated social cognition, maybe we could have like a theory-based scale. And also, qualify findings based on ideological topics rather than ideology, like, for example, abortion, support for abortion rights or support for women's rights is related to that, instead of saying, oh, ideology. Yeah. So that's it. So we have a few questions that I'm just going to skip, and I'm just going to go to and ask if folks have any questions.
Thank you, Flavio. It was an amazing presentation. I'm gonna ask a few questions for you of the participants, if you don't mind, if you have the time to answer them for us. Yeah, first of all, we all loved your slides. Like, your presentation is just perfect, aesthetic, extremely pleasing. So we are very thankful for your kindness to be here today with us, and also to take the time to prepare this. So we are very appreciative. First of all, we want to know if you can share your material with us, so we can also send to the participants, if you don't mind. Yeah,
Of course I can. Yeah, I can also send an entire website for you. So there's more. Let me show you.
That's perfect. More is always better. I have a question from Gabriel, actually, your dear friend. How do you see this going in the future? Do you see something that we can actually do to have more of a, replicable and more cohesive measures of ideology, or you just see this getting worse? What do you think?
So I think it is possible, but we require a lot of institutional effort. So we conduct American National Election Studies, or the Latin Barometer, or the European Social Value Survey, and that is institutional effort, right? So we're collecting all this data, and if you go to European Social Survey website, you're going to see that they are testing measures all the time, and they are like, oh, okay, this was not a good idea. Let's change. And a lot of measures are tested, and the evidence for it is on their website. So it works for that particular context. It works not only for that context, but in that political environment, right? So there could be institutional efforts towards this. Whether individual researchers can solve this, that is a different conversation. The most that individual researchers can do is use, to the best of their knowledge, validated measures, first of all. What they can do is to use more than one measure, so that they qualify their findings based on at least two scales, I would say, and also maybe across issues. So the idea of issue representativeness is super important, right? So if you're just talking about women's rights, is that ideology? Like, so it's just social rights? You also need to talk about economics, racial, like a lot of the cleavages that you have. And I also miss the theory part as well, insofar as we unfortunately are not, we're just creating measures after measures, and we're not taking theory into account, theories about how conservatism should work. And the link between political philosophy, right? Like the elite discourse and how it's observed by individuals in the population. So I think if we strengthen that link, that would be ideal. Yeah.
I have also a question from Leticia. She, again, appreciate, first of all, I'm going to read it, her words now. So first of all, the slides are beautiful and the presentation was incredibly clear and engaging. If people describe themselves as more conservatives than the scales indicate they are in practice, do you believe this would show a problem with the scales in covering the topics that people consider when describing themselves ideologically, or a distortion in people's perceptions on the concepts of conservative and liberal? What do you think?
Absolutely. I would say a 1,000%. But one of the old age questions, so I always try to come back to theory and literature, because I think measurement issues are abound. And it's nice to, it's not nice, but I can always pontificate about, oh, we should do this better, we should do that better. But how does that, evolve, and how does that help us as academics? To me is a far more important question. So to me, the major thing is, how do we make sure that we have cumulative research? How do we make sure that we are not discussing the same goddamn question for 70 years, which is the case on so many issues? And what I think Leticia is alluding to is the relates to the idea of the connection between symbolic ideology, how people feel their perceptions, and the connection with their policy preferences, whether they are or are not endorsing political preferences that are conservative or liberal, progressive or libertarian, etc. So we're still discussing whether there is a connection, and how is symbolic ideology better or worse. And there was another day a very prominent scholar publishing on how symbolic ideology is flawed for a given specific demographic group, and that might be the case, but without studying them together, it's very hard to understand. It's like looking at an elephant and you only can touch a part of the elephant. So I think we need better measures. So we need better instruments, and maybe zoom out and always study ideology looking at both the social identity or the symbolic aspect as well as the operational side of things. And obviously, the operational side of things in particular needs to take into account the political context. Different countries have different political issues. They have different institutions. They have different histories. And of course, that will impact how you measure ideology, right? And so we need to have that contextualization very much into account. Otherwise, yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here with us today. We don't have time for other questions, but we can, leave your contact and mediate any other questions that the participants might have. I know it was a bit hard for us to find a time slot that would work for both parties. So we really, really, really appreciate it. And we expect you to come back to Brazil soon to see us again. And we have a great time when you were here, and we hope that will be the same again. Thank you, Flavio.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah,
It's a
see
pleasure
ya.
on my end as well.
Bye-bye. We're gonna continue our event. Before we start with the next lecture, I'm just gonna let everyone know we have some issues with the YouTube transmission. So we're gonna make available our link to this Zoom call so you can join us in the Zoom call. Here the connection is a little bit better. We don't have a lot of problems with the Zoom connection. We are having problems with the YouTube transmission. So if you want to join us in the Zoom call, we're gonna make available the link so you can come to this call and participate. Okay. Someone will leave the link on the YouTube comments, so you can join us. That's it. So we're gonna go on with Professor Hiro. Hi, nice to meet you,
Hi.
Professor.
Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, it's perfect. Thank you. So I'm just gonna introduce you, and then you can, if you want, start sharing your screen, or you can do you. Thank you. We really appreciate you to being available to be here with us today. Valdir said amazing things about you, so we really appreciate your effort to be with us. So Professor Hiro is a lecturer at University of London. He completed his BA at Sophia University in Japan and his master's by research and PhD University of Kent in the UK. After finishing his PhD, he worked at Kochi University of Technology as a postdoc fellow. His academic interests lie in social and evolutionary psychology, and he's interested in understanding how reputation shapes human sociability. He has been undertaking a wide range of projects, and he addresses questions such as how indirect reciprocity, this word is also always getting me. Sorry, reciprocity guides intergroup cooperation, why people gossip, and how it facilitates prosociality, and how we can promote intergenerational post-disaster cooperation. Thank you so much, Professor, for being here, and you can feel free to start whenever you want. Thank you.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. How does it look?
Yeah, we can see it.
Why there's some. Okay. Okay, so I think it looks
because
fine.
it's a little small for us. I don't know if it's
Okay,
your
so
end
how
or
about this? Is it better?
it didn't change yet.
Okay.
It's not like it's not in presentation mode. It's just like the narrower. It's like in a cell phone, maybe.
Okay, so let me. Okay, so I'm just going to swap the screen. Okay, this screen. Okay. Okay, how about this?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so thank you again for the invitation, and very happy to be here talking about my research. So again, I'm Hiro Imada, and I'm lecturer in social psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London. So today, there is a bit, okay, let me turn it off. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about my current work on intergroup cooperation and also intergroup intergenerational cooperation. So I'm hoping that I can offer you some interesting perspective into understanding pro-climate actions through the lens of an intergroup relationship in the talk. So let me first talk about social dilemmas. Social dilemmas refer to the situation where personal and collective interests are in conflict. And then social dilemmas actually underlie a wide range of societal and global issues. So let me give an example of the social dilemma, first from the ancestral past. So in the ancestral past, so people have to cooperate in a big hunting. And then imagine you're one of the hunter-gatherers in the past, and you have two options. One is to rest, and the other is to engage in the collective hunting, risking your life. So if you purely think about your personal benefit, you definitely want to go rest and then watch your friends doing the hunting. And then if they successfully hunt down a big mammal, you can get some meat. But the issue here is, if everybody in the same community rests, so they are going to face the worst possible outcome, because nobody is hunting, nobody gets food. And then we can easily find a very similar example from the modern society, which is the climate change issue. So now we are standing at the very critical tipping point for climate change, and then we are now urged to change our behavior and habits drastically so that we can stop climate change. But if people think about their personal benefit, so changing their habit is a big deal and costly, so they may want to simply not do anything. And then they simply wish everybody else on the planet is doing something for the environment, and then they're going to solve the issue. But the issue again is, if everybody doesn't do anything, everybody doesn't change their behavior, so they're going to face the worst possible outcome again. So we call this worst possible outcome the tragedy of commons, and then we have a very rather problem in the social dilemmas. And cooperation is defined as the behavior that maximizes collective benefits rather than personal benefit in this social, dilemma context. And given the relevance of social dilemma to a wide range of societal issues like climate change, there has been a very rich and interdisciplinary literature looking at why people cooperate and how we can possibly promote cooperation. So how do we study social dilemma and cooperation? So traditionally, people typically use economic game paradigms, and an economic game paradigm is something that helps us abstract and stylize very complex social behavior into a measurable, simple exchange of money. So dyadic cooperation, for example, has been typically studied using something called the prisoner's dilemma game. And there are two versions. So when it comes to the binary version, the two participants or two players play this game together, and then they each has the same choice between option C and option D. So C stands for cooperation, D stands for defection. And when both players, player X and Y, both choose cooperation, they each get 1 point. But if they both choose defection, they each get 0. And when one cooperates and the other defects, the defector gets 2 points, whereas the cooperator gets -1 point. So this person loses a point. So if you think about your personal benefit, so defection, D, always gives you the better outcome, regardless of what your partner is doing. However, if you look at this matrix, thinking about the collective benefit, it is actually mutual cooperation that establishes the maximization of the collective benefit, because they collectively earn 2 points. But if they both choose defection, it brings the worst possible collective outcome, because they collectively earn 0. So you can see that this matrix, a very simple payoff matrix, actually reflects the underlying structure of social issues like climate change and hunting. And then when it comes to the continuous version, it is actually way simpler. So two players get some money, let's say $10, and then they have to decide how much money they would like to send to their partner, knowing that each dollar they send is going to be doubled before it is given to their partner. So here, the amount of money that they decide to give is the measurement of behavior cooperation. So there's a meta-analysis looking at the binary presence dilemma game, and this is Mengele 2018, and they found that when people play the game with a stranger, so the cooperation rate was only 37%. This is not a great number, and this actually clearly tells us it is very hard for us to establish mutual cooperation, given that we are always, lured towards defection, which helps us gain the most personally. Luckily, however, we know that there are some situations where people find it easier to establish a cooperation with others. And then one of the situations is when people play the game with somebody from the same group. So ingrovariatism is the tendency for people to be more cooperative with in-group members compared to out-group members. And here, in-group members simply mean people belonging to the same group, and out-group members mean those who don't belong to the same group at all. So for example, there's a study conducted back in 2008, and then they used the presence dilemma game, and then they used something called the minimum group paradigm. So this minimum group paradigm is simply letting us create experimental groups that mean nothing outside of the laboratories. So essentially, people are grouped into like team red, team green, or maybe people are classified based on their artistic preferences or whatever meaningless to our life. So in this experiment, participants played the presence dilemma game either with an in-group member or a person from the out group. And then they conducted this study in Japan and in New Zealand, and they found that people were more cooperative with a person from the same group compared to a person from the other group, both in Japan and in New Zealand. And then this finding has been replicated in a number of different natural group contexts. And then just to give you one of the examples, this paper by Romano and the colleagues, so this paper was published in Nature Communications like several years ago, and then they conducted this presence dilemma study looking at the nationality as a focal intergroup context. And they found that ingrovariatism was such a ubiquitous phenomenon. So in the figure, red dots represent cooperation with an in-group member, and the green dots represents cooperation with out-group members. And then on the x-axis, we have the cooperation percentage. So you can clearly see that, in-group cooperation is always higher than out-group cooperation. So finally, I just want to briefly mention several meta-analyses in the field. So one of the most famous meta-analysis in psychology is one by Balia and colleagues back in 2014. So they looked at over 100 effect sizes, and then they found that the meta-analytic effect size of ingrovariatism was 0.32, which was very big, given the average effect size social psychologists tend to deal with. And the economist Tom Lane conducted another meta-analysis looking at studies conducted within behavior economics, and then he had 441 studies at effect sizes, and then the overall meta-analytic effect size was 0.26. And then finally, Alex Lajic and colleagues conducted a meta-analysis focusing on studies involving kids. And then they had 69 effect sizes, and then the effect size was 0.22. So overall, there are so many studies displaying and demonstrating ingrovariatism, and then there is very strong and consistent meta-analytic evidence pointing to the robust nature of ingrovariatism. So now we know this is such a robust, consistent phenomenon. The next question we want to obviously ask is, why do people display ingrovariatism? And then addressing this question helps us identify how we can possibly promote cooperation with out-group members or global cooperation in general to deal with global issues like climate change. So social identity perspective is one of the prominent theories attempting to explain ingrovariatism. So according to this social identity perspective, so upon social categorization, individuals tend to value the welfare of in-group members as much as their welfare. So if you're familiar with social identity perspective, it's easy to take, but if you're not, so let me explain what it really means, social categorization. So imagine that you're watching a football game in a stadium, and then I can tell that it's very likely you think about yourself as one of the football supporters, rooting for the same club, and you now face the same opponent in the stadium. So when people are put in such a social context, so people tend to employ us versus them perspective to define themselves and to construe what's happening in the social world. So this is what social categorizations really mean. And then when people use social category to define themselves, so people tend to treat themselves and other in-group members as being interchangeable, and then this leads to something called depersonalization. And then this is exactly why social identity theorists argue that so people value the welfare of in-group members as much as theirs. And then this translates into people's tendency to cooperate more with in-group members. So several social identity theories actually claim that the measured strength of social identification should be possibly correlated with the extent of in-group favoritism they display. And then what's really important to the theory is that in-group favoritism emerge unconditionally. So as long as people use a social category to navigate the world, people should be favoring in-group members over out-group members. Yet, there has been an alternative competing account, which is group-bounded indirect reciprocity. Oh, I'm glad I pronounced it correctly. Okay, so what is indirect reciprocity in the first place? So indirect reciprocity simply refers to a system or reputation system in which people cooperate with others purely based on reputation. So within this system, people cooperate with others when this person, like other people, have a positive reputation, and then they don't cooperate with others with a bad or negative reputation. So within this system, so you are pretty much more motivated to be concerned about your reputation, because if you don't have a positive reputation, you never get cooperation from anyone in the system. So imagine that you have a chance to cooperate with somebody. So if you decide to cooperate, you have to incur personal cost because you have to give up the maximization of personal gain. However, if you cooperate, you can convince the partner that you are a good person. And within the system of indirect reciprocity, your positive impression is actually very easy to travel. And then other people in the same system or in the same community can actually know you are a good person. So you can establish a good reputation by being cooperative, and in the long run, as long as you belong to this reputation system, cooperation is beneficial. So this is why people tend to experience reputational concern, and this further motivates people to be pro-social and cooperative. And also within the system, people can expect other participating members to be cooperative because they understand how the system works. So according to this group-bounded indirect reciprocity perspective, so scholars argue that people intuitively assume that this indirect reciprocity system is bounded by group membership. What does it mean? So simply people intuitively think that in-group members belong to the same indirect reciprocity, but out-group members are completely outside of the system. So ultimately, it doesn't matter how people are perceived by out-group members, because out-group members are outside of this reputation system. And then there's no ground from which people can expect out-group members to be cooperative with them, because people themselves are outsider to the indirect reciprocity that out-group members themselves belong to. So according to this group-bounded indirect reciprocity perspective, so there are two psychological explanations for in-group favoritism. One, people experience increased reputational concern in the eyes of in-group members because they belong to the same system. So then this leads to increased cooperation with in-group members. The second explanation is people can expect in-group members but not out-group members to be cooperative with them, and this leads to higher cooperation with in-group members. And then what's really important to this perspective and to the debate between this perspective and the social identity perspective is that according to this theory, in-group favoritism should be conditional. So for example, when people are making a decision completely anonymously, people shouldn't be really favoring in-group members because, for example, reputational concerns shouldn't really matter. So we have three different psychological explanations for the emergence of in-group favoritism. So now I just want to briefly talk about one of my recent work looking at how those three different explanations together explain in-group favoritism. So we have three candidates: social identification, reputational concern, and expected cooperation. So I conducted two studies, I remember, but I'm going to talk about one study using the continuous presence dilemma again, which I already talked about. So in order to experimentally manipulate reputational concern and expected cooperation, I use something called knowledge manipulation. So in one condition, named the common knowledge condition, so it was a very basic prison dilemma game. So participants knew about the group membership of their partner. And also participants knew that their partner also knew about the group membership of themselves. So the person in the illustration says, I know my partner's group. On the other hand, in the unilateral knowledge condition, the participants knew about the group membership of their partner, but they were told that their partner didn't know about the group membership of them. So here, the partner says, I don't know my partner's group. So in a sense, in this condition, participants are kind of anonymous even when they're playing the game with an in-group member. And then in this condition, theoretically, reputational concern and expected cooperation should be suppressed when people are interacting with an in-group member. Because although participants know that they're interacting with an in-group member, this in-group partner doesn't know about the group membership. So people don't really have to be worried about their reputation. And then they can't really expect this in-group member to be cooperative because this in-group member, again, doesn't know they belong to the same group. So according to the group-bounded indirect perspective, we should observe in-group favoritism only in the common knowledge condition, but not in the unilateral knowledge condition. But according to the social identity perspective, it shouldn't matter. We should observe in-group favoritism in both experimental conditions. So the study followed a very simple design. So I orthogonally manipulated the group membership of the partner, and also I manipulated the knowledge. And then I measured social identification, reputational concern, and expected cooperation. So here I'm first presenting the results in cooperation. So first of all, there was significant in-group favoritism in both common and unilateral knowledge condition. So overall, in-group favoritism was not conditional to the anonymity, which supports the social identity perspective rather than the boundless indirect reciprocity perspective. And then now I'm presenting the results in reputational concern. Oh, by the way, so red bars represent in-group condition, and then blue bars represent out-group condition. So when it comes to reputational concern, I didn't find any differences between in-group and out-group condition. And then this is such a critical evidence against the reputation hypothesis, because when it comes to the reputation hypothesis based on the group-bounded indirect reciprocity account, people should be experiencing increased level of reputational concern in the eyes of in-group members. So there should be some difference between the in-group and the out-group condition in the common knowledge situation at least, but the difference was not significant. So this is conflicting with the reputation hypothesis from the group-bounded indirect reciprocity account. So when it comes to the expected cooperation, so I asked the participant how much money they expected their partner to have sent to them. This is a direct measurement of expected cooperation. And then this pattern was actually very consistent with the expectation hypothesis. So in a common knowledge situation, participants expected a random in-group member to be way more cooperative than a random out-group member. But this difference was not significant in the unilateral knowledge condition. So this supports the expectation hypothesis from the group-bounded indirect reciprocity perspective. So finally, what about social identification? So unfortunately, there weren't any significant correlations between social identification and the extent to which people displayed in-group favoritism. So in the common knowledge situation, the correlation coefficient was 0.10, not significant, and it was the same in the other condition. So further, I explored the group boundedness of the reputation path and expected cooperation path using this moderated mediation model. So what this result really suggests is actually quite simple. So the common knowledge treatment increases reputational concern, and then this further leads to the increased cooperation. And then this mediation path was not conditional to the group membership of the partner. So this effect of reputational concern was not group bounded, it was group unbounded. On the other hand, the common knowledge manipulation or treatment increased expected cooperation, but this effect was occurring only when the partner was in-group member. So the expected cooperation, the effect of this was actually group bounded. So this overall suggests that, it may be expected cooperation rather than reputation or social identification that explain the differing treatment for Ingram members and Algor members when it comes to cooperation in social dilemma. But I have to be cautious though. So this is a cross-sectional correlational data. So I'm simply playing with the correlational data. So I shouldn't be really talking about causality behind this. So overall, this study and the paper suggests that expected cooperation may be a plausible and a good candidate to explain why people favor Ingram members over Algor members. And then I was talking about a single study, but this finding has been replicated in so many different studies, including previous reports. So there is very consistent and robust evidence for this expected cooperation explanation of Ingram favoritism. And I'm just listing some of my papers supporting this same account. So finally, I just want to briefly mention the unconditional Ingram favoritism found in the paper I was talking about. So this unconditional nature of Ingram favoritism actually supports the social identity perspective. But I would say it could be because the study was probably overpowered because of the within-subject design. So I now want to just turn back to the meta-analysis. So the meta-analysis by Balia and colleagues, they actually looked at the meta-analytic effect sizes separately for the common knowledge condition and the unilateral knowledge condition. And they found that the effect size of Ingram favoritism in the common knowledge condition was 0.32, but the meta-analytic effect size, only looking at the unilateral knowledge situations, it was D of 0.04. And then this number was statistically not significantly different from 0. So overall, so the cumulative literature and meta-analysis suggest so Ingram favoritism is pretty conditional to the anonymity, overall supporting the group bounded index diversity account rather than social identity perspective. So when you read papers looking at cooperation or intergroup cooperation, including my papers, so you often find authors saying that their findings have close bearing on societal issues like climate change, because they're studying social dilemma, because they're studying cooperation. However, today I just want to take a moment to rethink about the nature of intergenerational dilemma, which actually represents climate change. And I just want to together think about the potential difference between non-intergenerational dilemma like hunting and an intergenerational dilemma like climate change. So if you think about hunting, if you cooperate, you can actually get some benefit for you, because successful hunting leads you to receiving some meat. But when it comes to the intergenerational cooperation, do you see you get some benefit by being pro-environmental? It is much less clear, right? And also, when it comes to the dyadic social dilemma, we found that expected cooperation is really important. But in the climate change, you're cooperating with and cooperating for people in the future, maybe people living in 2200 or something. So what does it mean that you expect future individuals to be cooperating? It's quite unclear. So it feels like the key psychological variable, expected cooperation, may be missing in the intergenerational social dilemma. So this is the normal continuous presence dilemma. But when it comes to the intergenerational cooperation, it is often unilateral. So you're not receiving anything from people in the future, but you're simply benefiting the future, right? And also, you cannot really expect your cooperation to be reciprocated by individuals in the future. And also, you can't really expect future individuals to be benefiting you, to be generating collective benefit that matter for you. Simply because if you think about 200 or 2100 or 2200, I'm afraid we will be all gone, right? So this leads to a quite important question. So we have been talking about expected cooperation and Ingram favoritism. And then people, including myself, often say, so if we think about climate change as a local issue, we may be able to promote cooperation because people find it easy to cooperate with Ingram members. But when it comes to the intergenerational social dilemma, do we actually observe the same pattern? Do we observe Ingram favoritism in the intergenerational context? which was not really sure. So I recently conducted several studies addressing this question. So to address this question, I have to use some game that can capture intergenerational cooperation. And then to this end, I use something called the Intergenerational Sustainability Dilemma game, ISDG for short. So in this study or in this game, so experimenter like myself, so I have to conduct several distinct experimental sessions. And then each experimental session represents a generation. So assuming that you are participating in the very first experimental session, you represent generation 1. And then in the experimental session, you have a choice between option X and option Y. If you choose option X, you can get 3,600 points. And if you choose option Y, you get 2,700 points. And then those points are later converted to actual money. So if you want to get more money, you have to go for option X. And then once you make a decision, your participation is over. And then this experimental session is also over. And then what's going to happen next is I'm going to conduct another experimental session. And then participant in the second session represents generation 2. And then your decision in generation 1 matters for the payoff that participant in the second generation can possibly get. So if you look at the generation 2, so if you choose option X, so participant in generation 2 face a choice between option X and option Y, but they can get 2,700 points and 1,800 points by choosing option X and option Y. So they get less money than you can by choosing the same option. But if you chose option Y, sacrificing your personal benefit, the person in the second generation or the second generation can actually face exactly the same payoff. So in this game, option X and option Y each represent selfish choice and sustainable choice. So this is how intergenerational cooperation is operationalized in this game. So to put it in a different way, so if you look at this table, so if participants in different generations keep choosing this sustainable option, all participants in different generations can keep getting 2,700 points. First generation, second generation, third generation, and so forth. But if if different generations keep choosing the selfish option, so the amount of money people can get rapidly decreases. So the first generation can earn 3,600 points, but second generation, they can only earn 2,700 points. And the third generation, 1,800. And the fourth generation, people can only earn 900 points. So if people choose a selfish option, they just keep decreasing the collective benefit over time. And then this represents the intergenerational nature of the social dilemma. So in my first study, I incorporated the group manipulation into this game, and in the in-group condition, which is the reddish illustration. So participants were told that their behavior would impact the future outcome and the future payoff for in-group members. So future generations, all participants belong to the same group. And in the out-group condition, which is the bluish illustration, participants are told that their behavior would impact the future generation, but the future generations all belong to the other group, so out-group. And the final control condition, I didn't tell anything about the group membership of the future generations. And then participants actually got paid based on their choice in the game. So in the second study, I just simply replicated the first study, but using a natural group context, which was Japan versus China. So I had Japanese participants come into the experiment. It was an online experiment though. And then in-group was Japanese people and out-group was Chinese people. I picked this context because Japan and China actually share several environmental issues together. So before I'm going into the results, so let me briefly talk about some predictors of intergenerational cooperation from the literature on pro-environmental behaviors and intergenerational cooperation. So there are several factors that are associated with intergenerational cooperation, and one of them is affinity. So affinity simply refers to what extent people are empathizing with future generation and to what extent people are willing to take the perspective of the future generation into account. And this is slightly similar to social identification in that they both deal with social preferences. And the second factor is generativity, and it has several different facets. So legacy motivation refers to the motivation for people to leave something positive for the future. And then this has been typically measured using some items like it is important to me to leave a positive legacy. And the second facet is reputational concern. So surprisingly, there are some studies suggesting that people do care about how they're perceived by people in the future. And the final facet is perceived responsibility. So there are people who genuinely feel responsible for the future. And then perceived responsibility has been measured by some items like I have a responsibility to consider the impact of my decision on future generations. So I just want to talk a bit about an interesting study about affinity and intergenerational cooperation. So I'm not going to read this experimental script at all, but what they looked at was harvesting behavior as a dependent variable. So the more people harvest, the more benefit they can generate for the current generation, but it damages the future generation, right? So as this harvesting behavior, so having this harvesting behavior as a dependent variable, so they looked at how affinity and altruism predict this. So they found that affinity was negatively correlated with harvesting behavior. In other words, affinity was possibly correlated with intergenerational cooperation, which makes total sense. But interestingly, they found that altruism, like trait altruism, was possibly correlated with harvesting behavior. In other words, it was negatively correlated with intergenerational cooperation. So this has some very important implications for what to think about. Because when it comes to prosociality or altruism, it may not really mean altruistic people are altruistic towards future generations. And maybe this altruism is exclusively for people in the future, people in the current generation. So this actually suggests that we really have to separate and then distinguish between, altruism towards the current generation versus altruism towards future generations. Okay, so there are actually some studies which I'm not going to talk about, which suggest that affinity and generativity may be group bounded, which means people feel more affinity, more generative concern when people think about future in-group members rather than out-group members. And if so, we should be able to observe in-group favoritism even in the intergenerational context. So this is the result. So in study 1, using the minimum group paradigm, so in the control condition, 48% of participants chose the sustainable option, and 58% in the in-group condition, and then 41% in the out-group condition. And I conducted the logistic regression analysis, and I found that the comparison between in-group and the control condition was significant, and also the comparison between the out-group and the control condition was significant. So essentially speaking, the in-group membership of the future generation promotes intergenerational cooperation / sustainable behavior, but out-group membership of the future generation actively discourages people to be sustainable. And then I replicated the pattern in the second study, which focused on Japan versus China context. And if you look at the row descriptive statistics, so the percentage of people who chose the sustainable choice was 27% in the out-group condition, which is really, really bad. And then again, so in the second study, I observed the in-group favoritism and also out-group derogation in the intergenerational dilemma context. And I just want to mention that when it comes to the normal, no intergenerational cooperation, people don't really display out-group derogation. So people simply cooperate more with in-group members, and then out-group membership has been known not to reduce out-group cooperation. But here, we found out-group derogation, which is quite unique. It could be unique to the intergenerational cooperation. So I followed up this behavior pattern using the mediation analysis, again, playing with the correlational cross-sectional data. And then I found that in study 1, so the effective in-group membership on sustainable choice was fully mediated by the responsibility. So when people think about the future as being about in-group, so it increases the responsibility for the future, and then this further translates into sustainable choice. And when it comes to the out-group derogation, So we found that reputational concern mediated the relationship between outgroup membership of the future generations and sustainable choice. And in study 2, so I replicated the pattern for the in-group heritage. So in-group membership of the future generation increases the responsibility for the future, and then this turns to the increased sustainable choice. When it comes to the out-group derogation, however, it was way more complex in the second study, which focused on the natural group context. So essentially, affinity, legacy, responsibility, but somehow no reputation, mediated the relationship between out-group membership and the sustainable choice. So this only suggests to me that in the natural group context, the psychological motivation for the out-group derogation could be really context dependent, and it's quite complex. So overall, so these studies looking at intergenerational intergroup cooperation have some interesting implications for what we do in this society to tackle climate issues. So first of all, we can possibly use like in-group framing to promote intergenerational cooperation. So maybe if we frame global warming as a local social dilemma issue, saying, okay, you British people, so your behavior is going to matter for the future of the UK, it can possibly effectively promote intergenerational cooperation. But this kind of group messaging or group intervention could be a double-edged sword, because if we emphasize the impact of the climate change on out-group members, it can actively discourage people to be sustainable or be the pro-environmental, as found in the studies. And this is very concerning, because I bet we have seen something like this in the past. So we all know that climate change is a global issue, but the immediate impact climate change has on different regions, different nations, it's quite substantially different. And Tsavo is a very good example, because this country, and there are so many islands that have been already actively sinking because of the immediate impact of climate change. And then people have been using such an example to promote the awareness about the climate change, to encourage people to be pro-environmental, to be sustainable. But if the findings from the studies of mine actually hold in the real life context, this kind of messaging can be actively backfiring. Because if people think that their behavior matters for the outgroup members, future of the outgroup, people may be simply discouraged to be pro-social, pro-environmental, sorry. So there's a very tricky trade-off between acknowledging the intergroup nature of the climate change issue and just talking about this in front of the people. So this figure from Lenton and colleagues in 2023 illustrates differing immediate impacts of climate change of different regions. There are some blue countries, blue states, and then those countries tend to get like much less impact from climate change. And then there are red nations, red areas that tend to get really harsh impacts of climate change. So again, the impact of climate change is different across different nations, different regions. But how can we actually acknowledge it? If we, emphasize this too much to normal lay people, they may think, okay, why would I contribute for other groups? Why would I contribute if I'm safe? And also when it comes to international climate policy making, so we tend to say stuff like, okay, we have to have this goal, and then every single country has to meet this goal together. But is it fair, or is it perceived to be fair by people from different countries? So we don't know. So we definitely have to incorporate this intergroup thinking into understanding and tackling climate change issue. But this perspective has been understudied there has been scant attention to this kind of thinking. So I'm hoping that the next generation of research and scholarship on the climate change issue should focus more on intergroup nature of the issue. So with this, I just want to say thank you to the organizer, and I'm very happy that I was invited to be talking about this with you. And if you are interested in my work, or if you want to talk about this work even after this event, so please feel free to reach out to me. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Hiro. It was an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I have some questions from YouTube, if you don't mind answering them. Do you have the time?
Sure.
Great. So I have a question from Roberta. She asked if there is, when countries are compared, is there any correlation for in-group and out-group cooperation? If it was mentioned, she was not able to get it.
So when it comes to the intergenerational cooperation studies, I really didn't look at correlation between those. No, so I don't know. But there should be some correlation, I'm sure, because when it comes to normal like cooperation, there is always like 0.3, 0.2, 0.4 correlation between in-group and out-group cooperation. So I would expect the same.
And from Valdir, a few questions. What are the consequences for the theory that reputational concern is not a good explanation for in-group favoritism? I'm gonna read both of the questions from Valdir, and then you can, if you need me to read them again, if you just let me know. What could theoretically explain its importance on in-group intergenerational cooperation, but not in-group favoritism?
Wait, so what is the really question about? Sorry, can you repeat that again?
Okay, I'm gonna read them again.
Yeah.
What are the consequences for theory of reputational concern in a
okay,
good,
so
is not a good explanation for
yeah,
in-group
so I'm gonna
Yeah.
answer to that question first.
Great.
So yeah, so reputation account hasn't been really directly supported in the previous studies, including mine. But it's not like it's kind of early to conclude that this hypothesis doesn't hold. For example, I mean, there are some studies showing that the importance of reputation may be different across different cultures. And actually, studies supporting this reputation account, they're all from Japan, which has some tight culture / low relational mobility. And the studies not supporting the reputation account, there have been done in the Western context, the UK, the US. So maybe there are some ecological contexts where reputation actually matters and is weighted more than expected cooperation. So there are some, like leeways or excuses we can make for this hypothesis. And then I would say there should be more research to be done about the reputation and hypothesis.
The continuation of this question is what could theoretically explain its importance on in-group intergenerational cooperation, but not in-group favoritism?
Okay, so I mean, so in my studies, I didn't really develop any theoretical perspective into understanding the in-group favoritism and out-group derogation in the intergenerational context. But I mean, what's really important here is first to know that, the psychological processes underlying in-group favoritism in non-intergenerational and intergenerational contexts are quite different. And it's also structurally different. So I'd say this field, intergroup intergenerational cooperation, is such an emerging field, and then we don't know much about it yet. So I'm hoping that in 5 to 10 years, I or somebody else will be crafting some very nice theory explaining this.
Great. Another question from Ana Carolina. Hello, thank you for your presentation. I'm curious about the concept of intergenerational cooperation. If there is no direct reciprocity from future generations, can we still view it as a cooperation per se? In the context of I'll break down the questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. So, I mean, cooperation can be defined in different ways depending on what field you're in. But I tend to use one from evolutionary biology, which is very simple. So cooperation is costly, but it maximizes the collective benefit. So if you know some game called Dictator Game, so you get money and you have to decide how much money you want to send to the partner. So there's no multiplier there. So if you give £5, the person gets £5. So you're not increasing the total benefit. So this is no cooperation. So if you use this definition of cooperation, so the cooperation measured in the ISDG game can be a proper cooperation.
In the context of climate change, might it be more accurate to consider this as a form of altruism rather than mutual cooperation? What this can impact for interventions in this topic?
Yeah, so I mean, given that when it comes to climate change, it's often unilateral, so you're not getting anything. So it's true that we can think about pro-climate actions as a pure altruism, but still we have to distinguish between altruism towards future generations and towards present generation. The study I mentioned clearly, demonstrate that.
Yeah. And another question, I don't know if anyone on Zoom wants to have to ask a question, you can leave on the chat. Just feel free to do so. Another question is from Huchi, which is, given that in-group favoritism tend to favor those with our group, could you explain expanding group inclusivity inadvertently lead to society more perceived permissive, sorry, she wrote so many hard words to say, of ethical or rule violations. How can interventions prevent this outcome?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very big literature looking at how like superordinate common in-group identity can promote like a reduced intergroup bias and promote intergroup cooperation. Now, I think we can use the same perspective, and I often joke that if there's like a very bad alien invading the Earth, we can probably get together and think about us as, you know, people on the same planet. But this is not really easy, as many studies have shown. You know, theoretically, there are many subordinate group membership we can totally utilize, like the Earth, the humanity. But it's not easy because it's often the case that local identities, local group memberships are just simply more salient all the time. Because why do I think about myself as a member of the Earth? You know, so we can definitely try to utilize it, but there's a long way to go, I feel like.
Yeah. That's perfect. Thank you so much, Hiro. It was really great to have you here with us today. Your presentation was amazing, and thank you for answering the questions for in our chat. We really appreciate your accepting being here today with us, and hopefully we get a chance to meet again in the future and maybe collaborating as a group soon, because cooperation is a very interesting subject for here in the lab. So we really appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed